Dreamworks is one of the most interesting studios out there, as they have made some of the best animated movies of all time and some of the worst. So today I'll be ranking all 46 Dreamworks movies from the abomination to the masterpiece. Now I'm obviously ranking a lot of our childhood favorites here, so remember, it's only my list and you're not going to agree. So leave your own list in the comments or just give me your favorites and least favorites. Now I'll only be including the main movies on this list, so no direct to video or streaming films. Then lastly, this took a very long time to make, so please consider subscribing for more big rankings like this one, and with that said, let's get started. Coming at last place is Boss Baby Family Business. This is a movie that shouldn't exist, and I hate that it does. How did Boss Baby get a theatrical sequel while movies like Megamind didn't? Sometimes it seems like Dreamworks is allergic to success. Now what do I dislike about this movie so much? It's hard to point it all out because it's basically everything. The plot is absolute nonsense, the characters are irritating, and the villain is easily the worst out of all of these films. While the first movie had some dumb ideas and concepts, this movie is even dumber. It just doesn't work. This is a franchise that shouldn't be a franchise, so for these reasons, it's the worst Dreamworks movie. Next up, Spirit Untamed, a movie that strips away every single thing that made the original stand out, which results in the most boring movie on this list. There was not one funny line, not one standout moment, not one memorable character, and it's an absolute chore to sit through. While the original told the story from the horse's perspective, this movie follows 3 annoying characters and gives Spirit himself 0 personality. Then even the animation in this one feels so cheap compared to the stunning 2D animation used in the first movie. I find it hard to even call this a sequel because it hardly is one. It feels like they just used the brand name to make a bit more money, and it doesn't feel like any continuation whatsoever, and in the end it has no reason to exist. Next up, B-Movie, a total misfire from beginning to end. It starts off feeling like a rehash of Ants, only with bees this time, but then it goes totally off the rails and becomes so weird. You get a bee and human romance, a courtroom drama,
Are you serious?
and an extremely dumb and scattershot plot. I'm kind to even call it a plot. It clearly didn't do its job well because I found myself rooting for every single villain in this movie more than the actual lead character. This movie is an absolute mess. Sure, it can be easy to enjoy because of the memes, but in the end, memes don't make a movie good. Next up, Boss Baby. A first time watch, and it wasn't the total unwatchable dump I was expecting it to be, but still, who came up with this idea for a movie? It is so strange and not in a good way. Sure, it can be kind of humorous seeing a baby talk about the stock market, but for most of the runtime, every single gross baby joke you can think of plays out. Just to the point where it becomes nauseating. And considering the really over-the-top and dumb idea, the movie gets so tedious the longer it goes. So for most of the movie, I was checking the runtime and couldn't wait for it to finish. However, it did have some Tobey Maguire narrations.
How'd that get in there?
Next up, we have Shark Tale, a movie where Will Smith plays a fish called Oscar.
Ironic.
And it's not very good at all. Firstly, the characters are pretty terrible. There are a few cases of this, but it feels like Dreamworks has an unlikable lead character problem, this being the case once again. On the topic of characters, the character designs look absolutely dreadful. It is especially shocking considering this movie only came out 1 year after Nemo. And that movie is so much better looking. Then this movie has so many references to other films.
Are you not entertained?
But it's references that kids won't understand, and this is a movie no adult would want to sit through, so it's just a weird mix. But hey, Martin Scorsese is in it, so I guess it classifies as cinema after all. Then we have Trolls Band Together. Now this isn't a franchise intended for me, so it's hard to really get any enjoyment out of it. I found this one to be the most mediocre and forgettable out of the 3, which definitely doesn't help. Sure, it had enough energy to keep it far from boring, but at times it feels too energetic, so it just leaves me exhausted. It is probably a good enough continuation, but it's a continuation of a franchise I do not care about. And it doesn't feel as original this time around, so it's the clear weakest one. Also, why did they have to bring the worst side character along for the journey?
Come on, Daddy. I'm the cutest little flower man.
Next up we have Turbo, a lame pizza knockoff that believes it has this super creative and clever idea, when in reality it really doesn't. Hey, snails are slow, right? But what if they were fast? It isn't a clever subversion of expectations at all, it is just a super dumb idea.
But your scientist was so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Then the plot is so predictable and it has an absolutely dreadful twist villain. But these reasons aren't even why it is so low. It is so low down because it has no excuse of being this boring and bad. The animation is really well made, the voice cast is fantastic, but all of this talent must put into a movie with a terrible premise. That brings us to Trolls. So Dreamworks decided to make a movie based on the Super Ugly Trolls doll, and the result is definitely not my thing at all. I mean, I'm not really the target audience, and I'm sure the target audience would like it. Did I like it? Not really, and I thought it got worse the longer it went. Now the highlight here is definitely the animation. It is super unique, and overall I still think this movie is totally watchable. There are definitely a few contrasting tones though. Cute happy trolls and glitter threaten to get eaten alive by violent monsters to cure their depression. An odd plot for sure. Then there was also this whole useless Cinderella side plot. Very weird. Next up, Ruby Gilman. Dreamworks' take on a high school movie, and it is definitely up there with one of their most generic movies. Everything is so predictable. Probably because they spoiled the whole plot in the trailers, like why would you do that? Even if they didn't, it wouldn't have mattered because the twists are so easy to guess in any case. Then because it is a high school movie, it automatically wins the competition for most awkward Dreamworks film. Not even the animation is anything special, and the character designs are actually almost Shark Tale level bad. This release in After Puss in Boots 2 sort of sums up this studio. They can release one of their best movies and one of their worst back to back. Then we have Trolls World Tour. Preferred this one slightly over the original, but it still has the problems of the other Trolls movies, as in I do not care for this franchise or these characters. I thought this one at least had a better concept. The idea about different music factions is kind of interesting, then it visually portrays those in very creative ways. And on that point, much like the first movie, the animation is so unique and it's even better looking this time around. While the concept is fun, the plot is kind of boring, and you get this whole useless side plot following a side character no one knows the name to go find his parents like no one cares. Then we have Ants. Dreamworks' first film is definitely not close to being one of their best, and it's really quite bizarre. At times, it doesn't even feel like a kids movie, whether that is because of the inclusion of minor curse words, ants getting tortured and decapitated, as well as deep themes about individualism. You know, stuff children would like. Then beyond that, the movie is just very ugly looking and the plot is super bland. What made it even funnier is that it came out in the same year as another Ant movie that was obviously much better. The lead character was also really annoying, but at least it had a few funny lines here and there, as well as Sylvester Stallone, but nothing more to offer. Next up we have Madagascar 3, the Fast and Furious of the Madagascar franchise, where logic is thrown out the window along with all believability. Now I know this is a franchise about talking animals, but you need some rules in your world, like the animals swim all the way from Africa to Monaco, and a tiger jumps through a keyhole.
The rules of physics don't apply to us.
It is just so dumb. Also, the premise doesn't really fit. Considering Alex got reunited with his family in Africa, now they're off to the zoo again. Really? That brings us to Home. A lot of the movies lower down are either total misfires, have terrible premises, or just plain boring and mediocre. This movie is so low down because it is annoying. And it's not just annoying, it's very annoying. Whether that refers to the way the aliens talk, the lead character, the side characters, the humor, all of it is pretty hard to sit through. And it doesn't do much to make up for it. The whole setup for the plot about the email is just so lazy and contrived. Then the main plot being about kitty aliens placing people in concentration camps, not great either for obvious reasons. But hey, at least the score is surprisingly good. That brings us to Shrek the Third. By this point the franchise felt tired and lost the magic that made the original movie so good. The fun, clever humor is replaced by cheap and lazy humor, and the plot is so incredibly boring and mediocre. Not something that should be said about a Shrek film. Then by reusing the villain of the previous movie, it just doesn't add anything new to the franchise and ended up feeling like a rehash. Even with the introduction of well-known characters like King Arthur, it still feels so forgettable. Because it is Shrek, I can still have fun with it here and there, but still, not enough to bump it higher. Then we have the Penguins of Madagascar. If Madagascar 3 started going too far, this movie goes completely off the rails, and totally abandons the premise of the previous movies. What started out as a franchise about zoo animals in the wild, now involves a team of animals, spies, and mutants. It is really dumb stuff, but I feel like it sort of fits these characters.
It's so dumb, it's brilliant.
No! It's just dumb.
Now, I do not think each side character needs their own movie. These probably should have just stayed side characters. But it is higher than Madagascar 3 because I do find it kind of funny at times, and it gets so dumb it almost becomes enjoyable. Then we have Captain Underpants. Now I know a lot of you like this one. As someone who hasn't read any of the source material and watched this movie for the first time when I was 20, you can probably understand why I didn't like it all that much. This movie's main thing is basically toilet humor. They even joke about it in the movie, calling it the lowest form of comedy, which I fully agree with. So I was sitting with a straight face for most of the time due to the never-ending amount of the most juvenile humor you can think of. Now it isn't all bad, the art style or multiple art styles used are pretty cool, and there's a lot of creativity that went into it. It is really obvious the creators really respect the source material, which I wish was more common. Then I actually kind of liked the movie before the hypnotizing scene. It captures the feeling of school pretty well. That brings us to Monsters vs. Aliens. It's fine, it's harmless enough. It never did anything to make me mad, but it also doesn't do anything super unique or interesting either. The characters were kind of memorable and the concept is fun enough, but I can easily picture a much better version of this movie. I did enjoy all of the sci-fi movie references though, that was kind of fun, but the movie as a whole was just okay. Then we have Flushed Away. It has all of the burping, spitting and singing sluts that you would expect from a movie with that title, but like the other Aardman films, there's definitely a lot of clever humor too. I do feel like this one doesn't have the creative spark the others have, especially on the animation front. It is pretty bland looking compared to the usual stop motion. I do really like the voice cast though. You got Hugh Jackman, Ian McKellen, Andy Serkis and more. The characters they were all playing however weren't too memorable. The standout characters were definitely the two henchmen, they were pretty funny. The villain's motivation was basically exactly the same as the villain in Ants, as he too wants to flood an animal city so it can be repopulated. We have seen it before, but it was a bit better this time around. That brings us to Mr. Peabody and Sherman, a good enough little time travel movie, but it's not really much more than that. I didn't find myself caring for anything too much, and it definitely has a bunch of frustrating flaws. For one, it gets way too silly and goofy at times with the humor, and the two children characters are extremely annoying. But when it does focus on the time travel aspect, going to all these different eras, I thought it was a fun enough time. So it's definitely a good movie to teach children history in a way that's still entertaining for them, and that is kind of exactly why I didn't care for it. Next up, Crude's New Age. Definitely felt like a big step down from the original. While it still has some laughs and the creative environments that made the first movie so unique, it felt a lot more annoying overall. It also sort of rehashes the plot from the previous movie, just done in a less exciting way. Greg doesn't like change or getting along with strangers, we have seen it before. Then the majority of the runtime is pretty low on action, as they spend most of the time hanging around the treehouse, with some exciting scenes only happening near the end of the movie. When the action happened, it was great, it just doesn't happen enough. Then we have The Road to El Dorado. This was my first time seeing it, and I thought it was fun enough. I do quite like the style of 2D animation that Dreamworks has in some of their older films. Especially here, there are some stunning shots with great color usage. The two lead characters were fun too, but overall it isn't one that left any impact at all. I don't really have much negative to say, but nothing extremely positive either. It was enjoyable enough, but not something I would ever watch again. That brings us to Wallace and Gromit, another movie where I found it entertaining enough, but it didn't really leave any impact. The humor was pretty clever and creative at certain points, and the style of doing stop motion is very impressive looking. However, I've always found these Aardman character designs to look a bit cursed. I also didn't find myself caring for the plot too much. It seemed like quite a random one to choose, but it was still fun enough, just not one I really cared for. That brings us to Madagascar, a childhood favorite that I watched quite a lot growing up, but it's one of those movies that just work better when you're a kid compared to watching them later in life. The characters or plot doesn't really have much depth to it, but it's still a fun enough concept for a film. How would zoo animals react to the wild? Yeah, that could work as a movie, and overall it did its job well enough. There are actually a bunch of really funny lines.
That room has some nifty little sinks you can wash up in, and look! Free mints!
And obviously a ton of really memorable characters. I did definitely like the movie more before they actually reached Madagascar, but it's still a fun time. Next up, Shrek Forever After. Definitely a huge improvement over the third film, but it still doesn't quite recapture the magic. While it has a pretty lazy setup, I think the plot is quite fun for the most part. It is basically Back to the Future, as they do a whole alternate timeline version of the first film, which can make it stand out quite a lot. There are definitely some inconsistencies and plot holes, where it previously took them days of travel to get to Fiona's tower in the first film, and now Shrek travels the distance in no time at all. The villain was really entertaining, and overall it's a good film, not great though. Hopefully Shrek 5 will recapture the magic of the first two movies. That brings us to Spirit, one of the studio's more serious films, which I kind of appreciate about it. Due to the time period it is set in, it offers something new and different, and even without a ton of dialogue, it is able to tell its story very well. A lot of that is obviously due to animation, which allows these horses to emote, which in the end means dialogue isn't even necessary. The animation is very good looking too, but because this movie is so serious, it is definitely not the most entertaining, which doesn't make it as fun and exciting as some of the other movies on this list. The music also feels out of place, so for a lot of the runtime, it feels like I'm watching a Bryan Adams music video instead of an actual movie. Then we have Abominable. Overall, it's a pretty cute film that really stands out the most in the stunning animation and violent music. Then the Yeti himself is such an enjoyable character. Now it isn't higher up because it is a bit familiar, especially the villain's motivation, which is very similar to Charles Munn's in Up. They also try giving the main character some depth and backstory, but it ultimately feels hollow because the Yeti is the clear standout, so I didn't find myself caring for the other characters too much. Still think it's pretty good, but I don't think I'll remember much about it in the future. Next up we have The Croods, another one I watched quite a lot growing up, almost burning myself out on it. Rewatching it this year, it was still pretty entertaining, nothing fantastic or anything, but it passed the time. While you do get a ton of moments when Nicolas Cage makes weird noises and gets hit by boulders, when you get to the heartfelt moments they work kinda well. As it tackles themes about family, letting go, and change. I think my favorite thing about it might honestly just be the setting and creature designs. So much creativity went into these environments, also the score is really good. Then we have Sinbad. I'm probably the only person that has this movie this high up. Rewatching it brought back so much nostalgia as I used to put it on all the time as a kid. Then just completely ignored it until now, and I can see exactly why I loved it so much back then. It is very much my type of movie. Action scenes, large monsters, rich world building, and a sense of adventure. It is kind of like an animated version of Pirates of the Caribbean. I also love how this animation was done, as it combines 2D and 3D animation, which is something I wish we saw a lot more of. Now what holds it back is the super unlikable lead character. I found myself rooting for his friend much more than him, so by the end it was a bit unsatisfying, but still really enjoyed this one. Also the villain is
Eris, the goddess of discord.
Next up we have Chicken Run. While I'm not really someone for these Aardman movies, I thought this one in particular was pretty good. It combines your classic Prison Break formula with obviously chickens, and it turned out to be a lot of fun. The humor in this movie is very good, and it never feels like dumb childish humor like a lot of the movies lower down suffer from. Instead, these jokes are pretty well thought out, and some of the dialogue is really clever. Especially all the wordplay. Not one that left the biggest impact, but still fun nonetheless. That brings us to Madagascar 2. While I liked the first film a lot less on rewatch, I liked the sequel a lot more than I remember. Still isn't top tier or anything, but it definitely had a much better plot than the original. Each of the 4 main characters are given their own little subplot and character development, which all paid off nicely in the end. It was also a lot funnier than I remembered, and some of the emotional moments worked pretty well. In a movie with a grandma and a lion throwing fists, it can obviously be pretty silly at times, but just the right amount. Not going full on Madagascar 3 just yet, so for those reasons it's the best in the franchise. Then we have The Bad Guys. From here on, Dreamworks really started to lean into wild and creative animation styles, which made this one in particular so fresh. The action is also fast-paced and exciting, and it has such a cool look to it. Then the main plot itself is pretty good, as it follows the formula of a heist film. So you get some Mission Impossible vibes at certain points, and of course there's a fun set of characters. And by the end, because you're invested in these characters, the redemption feels earned. Now it could have been higher if it wasn't for a few annoying distractions, like why is the governor of a human city a farts? Small stuff like that causes the world to lose some believability, but still a fun ride. Then we have Kung Fu Panda 4. Now I absolutely love this franchise, and I'm happy to say that it still has no bad movies, as this is another solid addition. It for the most part does everything right that you expect from a Kung Fu Panda movie. It has great action, stunning animation, fun characters, a memorable villain, and good humor. I honestly think this one might have the best fight scene since the original. It also does a good job of opening doors for future sequels, and it's able to continue Poe's story very well. The new character was also a lot better than I expected, but while it does a lot right, I still can't help but feel like there could have been a better version of this movie. It kind of lacks the emotion of the others, and bringing Tai Line back could have easily added that into this movie with a satisfying redemption arc. So it is weird the villains were given so little screen time, and Shen and Kai didn't even say a word at all. Speaking of actors not returning, it is unfortunate the Furious 5 were hardly in it. The plot was also pretty predictable, but in the end I found it effective enough. I can see why many would probably not like this one, but for me, while it could have been better, I still enjoyed it. It didn't ruin anything that came before and just gave us another peek into a world I really like. Then we have Rise of the Guardians. This movie definitely has a pretty fun concept, as it is sort of like the Avengers but with all of these well-known fantasy characters. I love team-up films, and here you get a great set of characters. Hugh Jackman as the Easter Bunny definitely been a fun twist. Then the animation and aesthetic is all very cool looking, however I do find the human face designs to look a bit odd. And because it presents all of these characters as heroes fighting off evil, you get a surprisingly large amount of epic battle scenes in a movie involving Santa and the Tooth Fairy, so one of the most creative movies on this list for sure. Next up we have Over the Hedge, one I've seen a handful of times as a kid, and rewatching it now, it was a lot better than I remembered.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
Big standout here is of course a great lead character played by Bruce Willis, and I've said many times in this video already, but this studio really has some great voice actors. One trope I see these movies do quite a lot is the unlikable character arc, where a flawed hero becomes selfless in the end. Sinbad did it, El Dorado did it, Shartail did it, and out of all of them, it is done the best here, as this character's arc actually feels satisfying and earned. Overall, super entertaining movie. On to the next. Up next, we have Puss in Boots. This is a great example of how you spin off a side character into their own movie. Something a lot of other animated movies definitely don't do right. Puss in Boots has enough charisma and personality to carry his own film. And due to him being a very different character than Shrek, it has a very distinct style and vibe, making it stand out in this franchise. Not too much to say here, it is really enjoyable, with a fun set of characters and a world that is exciting to explore. Then we have How to Train Your Dragon Hidden World. Overall, a great conclusion to one of the best animated trilogies of all time. It definitely isn't as good as the other two for me, but when you get to this movie's highs, they are so high. The epilogue is so powerful and emotional, then you get a great new villain who presents a different challenge to the heroes, as he uses strategy and intelligence to combat them. And obviously, the animation is breathtaking. I do find this one's main plot a bit more forgettable than the others, and looking at the previous movies and how big and epic in scale they went, this one's main thread felt a bit underwhelming, especially coming off the second movie, but still great movie, probably the funniest one too. Next up, Megamind. A first time watch and it was really good. The same way Shrek subverts fairy tale tropes, Megamind does it with the superhero genre, specifically Superman. And as someone who loves superhero movies, this was definitely my thing. You get some great fight scenes and a ton of twists and turns in the plot to always keep it engaging. The lead character himself, while he is a villain, is so likable and easy to root for. So when he is given a redemptive arc, it is satisfying. Then the movie explores ideas about purpose, morally grey heroes and villains, all in a very entertaining way. Then we have Kung Fu Panda 3. Now up until the fourth film, this was always referred to as the worst of the trilogy, and while it is the weakest, it is still awesome. As I have mentioned, I'm a big fan of this franchise, so it's probably not surprising I like this one too. It really does feel like the perfect next step though. Po meeting his dad and going to the panda village. Great plot for a third film. Then like the others, you get a great villain in Kai. He may not have the depth of the previous villains, but I mean come on, that soundtrack makes up for it. He can also be really menacing and kind of entertaining at the same time. J.K. Simmons been a great pick to voice him. So while this movie doesn't have the absolute highs of the previous two, I think it's still really good. And they could have honestly ended the franchise here. Then we have Shrek 2, a fantastic sequel that builds upon the really strong foundation laid in the first movie and gives us more of what worked in that movie, like the fun fairy tale twists and clever humor. And in doing so, you get a sequel that is almost just as good as the original, and one that many of you probably might prefer. Mainly due to nostalgia, I still prefer the first one, but this one is obviously very good too. You get some great new characters like Puss in Boots and some memorable villains too. Then compared to the first film that had a very straightforward plot, this one has a lot more layers, twists and turns. And where they take the story definitely feels like the logical next step. Then we have Puss in Boots' Last Wish. Now I know you're probably wondering why this isn't higher up. Most of you will probably have it in the top 3, and while I love this movie and love that the world liked this movie so much, there are still others I prefer over this one a tiny bit. It is still so fascinating how a sequel to a movie that sort of got lost in Dreamworks' long filmography became such a big hit. It truly shows the power of a good script, which this movie definitely has. Obviously the animation is amazing, probably the best out of all of these movies. Then it manages to not have one great villain, but 3. Each of them sort of represents the 3 types of villains you get. The sympathetic villain, the pure evil villain, and the morally grey villain. I hope Dreamworks saw what worked here and try and incorporate this magic into their other movies. Then we have How to Train Your Dragon 2, possibly the darkest and most emotional film on this list that feels so mature, and looking at this trilogy, it made sense and suited the story very well. By now, Hiccup has aged, and so has the audience of the first film, so going a more mature route was a great idea. One of the highlights of this film is the incredible soundtrack that feels so sweeping and captivating, just going so well alongside the hauntingly beautiful visuals. Then it continues Hiccup's character arc in the best way as he becomes chief by the end, and when you get to this movie's emotional moments, they are heartbreaking. Next up, Prince of Egypt, another childhood favorite of mine and probably the best biblical film ever made. This might be the most mature movie on this list, as it never feels like it tones down any of the dramatic elements of this story, which is something you would definitely expect a kids movie to do. But even without doing it, it's still such a great family film. The animation is stunning, the music is obviously so memorable, and I love the depiction of Moses and Ramses as brothers, which adds an extra layer of emotion. Not fully top 3, but still, easily one of the best. Then we have Shrek, again a movie I grew up watching so many times, and even to this day it remains so rewatchable and entertaining. This franchise is known for their clever spins on classic fairy tales and tropes, and it was all done the best in the first film. Shrek is of course such a fun and likable character, but really all the side characters in this movie are so memorable and unique in their own way. The humor is really clever too, and it is so quotable.
What are you doing in my swamp?
So while many might prefer the second film, I still think the first did it the best, and it will always be such a special animated movie to me. Entering the top 3, we have How to Train Your Dragon. I mean, what hasn't been said about this movie already? It's easily one of the best animated movies of all time, and it's honestly a near perfect, if not perfect film. The score, the settings, the character arts, it's all masterfully crafted. And it's a film where I can't decide what my favorite scene is because it's so consistently great from the opening line to the credit roll. Obviously, the heart of this film is the friendship between the two leads that really anyone with a pet can resonate with. You get it by now, it's a great movie, but there are 2 more I prefer. In second place, Kung Fu Panda 2. Just like How to Train Your Dragon, the second Kung Fu Panda also takes a much more serious and mature route, which leads to another really emotional sequel and one of the best movies on this list. Honestly, it's even more than that, it's one of the best sequels in general. It takes sort of a joke in the first movie about Poe's dad being a goose, then creates one of the most emotional character backstories I've seen in an animated movie. That gives our lead character such a satisfying character arc. On that point, this movie contains my favorite scene in any Dreamworks movie, which is when Poe finds inner peace. Then you get a really menacing and terrifying villain in Shane, and like the rest of the franchise, great cinematography. It could honestly almost be tied for first place, but the main reason it isn't is because I do think the second half is significantly better than the first. While the original Kung Fu Panda is just an evenly great film from start to finish, so on that note, coming in at first place is Kung Fu Panda. Now is this a biased pick? Yes it is. This is my comfort movie. I can put it on any time of the day, any day of the year, and I'll be able to have fun with it. It is so rewatchable. This movie takes an idea that sounds silly about animals doing kung fu and plays it out seriously, creating one of my favorite animated movies of all time. While Kung Fu Panda 2 has the emotion and 3 and 4 have the humor, this one has a perfect mix of both. Obviously, Poe is such a fun character that delivers plenty of laughs, but then you also get a lot of heartfelt moments too. I especially love the growing master and student relationship that is really satisfying by the end. The entire line might be my favorite Dreamworks villain, as you can fully see where he's coming from. And obviously, this movie has some great and really memorable fight scenes, the prison escape and bridge scene being standouts. Then like the others, everything is so good looking and the music by Hans Zimmer is incredible. It's a movie where, even after watching it so many times, I always notice something new on each rewatch. So for these reasons, Kung Fu Panda is my favorite Dreamworks movie, so it comes in at first place.